It's easily both the most famous and infamous firearm in all of the world's history. With over 100 million made, its appearance in over half a century of cinema, and its place in the hands of players in hundreds of video games, the Avtomat Kalashnikova model of 1947 is undeniably the most recognisable weapon ever made. We've come here to the Royal Armouries Museum in the UK to chart the AK-47's journey, from its creation through to its huge pop culture footprint.
In the context of entertainment, it makes perfect sense to fully embrace that stereotype of the AK as rough, ready, but reliable and powerful.
So why is the AK-47 such a legendary weapon? Why is AK-47 used as a catch-all term? And why do so many games get this famous firearm so wrong?
The AK-47 or Kalashnikov model 1947 is a 7.62 by 39mm gas-operated assault rifle developed within the Soviet Union by T-34 tank commander and designer Mikhail Timofeyevich Kalashnikov. Mikhail was wounded during the German invasion of the USSR in 1941 during the Battle of Bryansk. While in hospital, he overheard fellow soldiers complaining about their rifles, and having seen firsthand the combat advantage the German forces had thanks to their superior firearms, Kalashnikov resolved to develop a better weapon for his country's forces. Kalashnikov would take a number of weapons through prototyping stages, including early versions of this famous rifle, which won a 1946 Soviet rifle design competition. By November 1947, he had further simplified the rifle's production and design, and it was this 47 model that would enter the 1947 and 48 Soviet army trials, impressing the Soviet military enough that in 1949 they would adopt the weapon into military service.
It was a desirable firearm for many reasons. It was easy to operate, capable of automatic fire, remained reliable under some of the harshest conditions, and in relative terms, it was cheap and easy to mass produce.
Its reliability is historic, as is the sheer number of them that have found their way around the world. The AK's silhouette is iconic, with Mozambique even putting it on their flag, and you would be hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't know what an AK-47 is, or an action movie franchise that hasn't featured them, or especially an FPS series that hasn't taken inspiration from them.
For all of its fame and infamy, for everything its symbolism represents, and for all the times it's graced our screens, it makes it all the more peculiar that, technically, so many of us have been misnaming it all along.
If we want to get super technical, so the prototype that was accepted for service in 1947 was the AK-47. But strictly speaking, that was just one of many prototypes, and that's the one they settled upon. You can call it the AK-47, but if you're going to, really, it's probably just the very first version that were made, really for only a year or two, from 1949. We shouldn't really call anything later than that an AK-47, but that ship has sailed. The name has become iconic as AK-47, and we're never going to stop people calling it AK-47.
One of the key factors that led to the AK's immense reputation was the sheer quantity that it was produced, finding their ways into all sorts of corners of the world. It is by far the most produced firearm in history.
The AK is an amazing weapon, justified in its place in history and in contemporary use as well, of course. But part of that story is just the sheer number that were made and the sheer number that were put out there by the Soviet Union. But then also licensed and unlicensed production means that we have more of these things than any other single type or category, even of firearm, out there. And this is why you'll see estimates of between 75 million and 120 million. No one even knows how many of these things are out there.
Another element of its popularity, and why one version or another of the AK platform is found around the globe, is that the format was constantly being tinkered with and iterated on. The M in AKM, standing for modernized, is a simplified, lighter version of the AK platform that was more optimized for mass production, and it was this version that would become the Soviet Union's service rifle from 1959, and for its advantages, become the most prevalent version across the globe, a fact that remains true today.
Due to its success and fame, the rifle has been widely imitated, with many countries producing their own variant of the platform, the most popular of which being the Chinese Type 56.
They're similar enough that a lot of games and movies will mismatch their names or use AK-47 as a blanket term. But if you're ever in a game and want to know if you're aiming down the sights of a Soviet AK or a Chinese Type 56, you can take a look at the hooded front sight. If it's closed, then it's probably a Type 56, open, then it's an AK. This is a minor detail that's often overlooked in games, but once you notice these little characteristics and clashing names, you will no doubt start seeing them in many of your favourite shooters.
But what about the AK of today, and how has its legacy continued into the modern day?
The 5.45 by 39mm cartridge of the AK-74 and AK-74M are currently the main service rifles for over a dozen countries. But the modernized version of Kalashnikov's Model 1974 that is in use today only entered production in 1991. And more recently, the future main service rifle of the Russian army, the AK-12, saw its first confirmed use in a conflict during the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. There are of course many more variants or new versions of the rifle that we see pop up in games and movies. There's the RPK, which is basically the light machine gun parallel of the AKM. There's a slew of AKs featuring a folding stock marked by an S in their designation. The further compacted AKS-74U, often miscategorized in video games as a submachine gun, as well as the AK-15, 19, 101, 102, 103, 104, 105, and even beyond throughout the AK-100 and 200 series. All of this is to say that the platform and legacy of Mikhail Kalashnikov is still going strong.
With such a vast legacy and reputation in the real world, it's hardly surprising that the AK-47 in all of its forms and variants has become such a juggernaut within pop culture.
Its most iconic early entry is surely in 1997's GoldenEye 007 for the Nintendo 64, where the weapon was given its first alternate universe title as the KF-7 Soviet, a name that I think we can agree keeps the AK-47 flavour and a design that definitely keeps the stylings of the real deal. The early 2000s saw a lot of games explore different conflict zones and settings, with many military shooters taking place in the Middle East, like Conflict Desert Storm, across the Vietnam War in titles like Viet Cong or Men of Valor, as well as featuring in games involving cops, criminals, or counter-terrorists from GTA 3 to Counter-Strike.
What is interesting though is that each of those games have diverse gameplay, locations, time periods, and stories, yet the AK feels at home in each and every one of them.
Of course, the AK is also an icon on the silver screen as well, with America being at the forefront of cinema since the early 20th century, and given the AK's history and use among so many that the USA once called enemy, the Russian AK has become the quintessential bad guy gun.
If I had to pick one reason why the Kalashnikov is as iconic as it is, it's probably the Vietnam War. This is where the West really ran into this actually quite well established new rifle. I think a lot of the obsession with the Kalashnikov in the West is to do with that. It's the weapon of the enemy, be that the Soviet Union, the Cold War. But if you have to pick a ground zero for its cultural popularity, it's probably that. You know, it then crops up in all of the Vietnam War movies, stories and pictures as well of GIs picking up the Kalashnikov in favour of their M16, which at that time might not be working so well, and then it just doesn't go away from there.
In the 80s and 90s, Soviet and Russian forces were a common antagonist in plenty of spy films and action movies, meaning that the AK was commonplace in films like Air Force One and the Rambo series, as well as being found in the hands of James Bond in Octopussy or GoldenEye.
Media can be used as propaganda, either aggressively or more subtly. And with a huge amount of that media being made by or set in NATO countries, it's not surprising that the armaments that are featured in those stories follow those political lines.
So often we have seen the stereotypical good guy in action movies wielding things like AR-15s, Glocks or MP5s, weapons of the West mirrored by movie bad guys and antagonists using Russian AKs or Chinese Type 56 rifles. Although perhaps one of the most iconic AK scenes in any piece of media, or maybe just my favourite, is with Yuri Orlov's fawning love letter to the rifle.
It will shoot whether it's covered in mud or filled with sand. It's so easy, even a child can use it, and they do.
Much like its depictions in Hollywood, the AK's appearance in video games have very much followed the firearm's many tropes.
Pop culture will play to its reputation of reliability and resilience, showing the AK as a weapon still going strong after the world has ended, as seen in post-apocalyptic games like the Fallout franchise, the Metro series, or Stalker. Games have also followed the trend of showing it as a weapon of enemy combatants in the same settings and backdrops that films have. with many players first encountering the weapon in story modes and campaigns being where they lift it from the ground after dispatching an enemy. The AK also helps diversify the inventory of our virtual armories, both with its recognisable silhouette, aesthetic and wooden furniture that's often at odds with Western weapon designs, but also in the way it performs, where it's often portrayed with higher stopping power and more recoil to boot. For the most part, games follow this formula with their AKs, making them do more damage than the M4 or AR-15 alternatives. Many of the Call of Duty titles over the years have done exactly this, giving their AKs more damage but dialing back their rate of fire to further accentuate the slower chug of the virtual AK-47. In games of Counter-Strike, you'll often see counter-terrorists ditching their M4s for the enemy's cheaper AK due to its ability to penetrate helmets and result in a one-shot headshot. And in Escape from Tarkov, multiple variants of the AK can be found across its maps and traders, as well as in the hands of both AI and player scavengers, with the weapon and its ammunition being all the more plentiful due to its setting in a fictional Russian city.
Personally, I think Escape from Tarkov takes the trophy for the best virtual representation of the AK platform, and not just because it features so many different variants of the dang thing,
but also for its detailed aesthetics, its animated working parts, and playing on the resilience of the weapon by showing it operating without a dust cover or a muzzle brake, and with the thing still firing despite whatever trash you're throwing through the barrel. Although I suppose it's not surprising that a Russian studio has built the best virtual AKs.
The name AK-47 is iconic and recognisable, so it's not surprising that many games will choose to keep the designation regardless of if they modelled their in-game version off of a different variant or not.
A lot of games will lean more on the aesthetics of the weapon because they know that the large majority of players will glance at it and associate it with being an AK, even if it's GTA 5's Type 56, simply named Assault Rifle. Or even when developers want to avoid the actual designation but still want the weapon to feel Soviet, we get names like Perfect Dark's KF7 Special, Sniper Ghost Warrior 3's AK-47, the Metro franchise's Kalash Rifle, or my personal favourite, Kane & Lynch 2's Kaliningrad 47. All of this shows that developers can be pretty fluid with naming conventions and small details, but still give the player the feeling that they're using an AK-47, as after all that's what the majority of players will know it as and may even refer to it by.
And even more interesting is when games try to create the connection and aura of an AK, even in games that are set in the far future or in different realities altogether.
Apex Legends has its VK-47 flatline, its title obviously a nod to the AK-47, with much of its aesthetics made to look like a science fiction bullpup AK. Or Valorant's Vandal Rifle, which is a punchier and slower option of the fully automatic rifles available to purchase. Obviously its stylings are heavily influenced by the real-world AK, and its performance in-game follows established tropes. Call of Duty titles still need an AK for their inventories, even if they're leaning into a future setting, and that gives us the Black Ops 4 KN-57 or Infinite Warfare's Volk rifle. And of course, Borderlands has a whole manufacturer that apes the Soviet stylings of weaponry in Vladov, with a lot of these over-the-top weapons featuring elements from either an AK or one of its lookalikes. It goes to show that wooden furniture, utilitarian design, and a good amount of stopping power can be especially useful on a planet like Pandora. But all of these examples of misnaming, mishmash designs, or hints of an AK just scratches the surface of what so many virtual weapons lean into.
So the AK in video gaming history, it's so iconic, it's another one of those designs that you have to get right to some extent, and it's hard to get badly wrong. If games fall down at all, they fall down, as everyone else does, by depicting the AK in caricature almost. So you have a beefier, heavier recoiling cartridge, which gives you more damage in terms of hit points or whatever, but maybe your dispersion of shots opens up quicker, the animation of the model recoils more and takes more time to settle down after a burst. So you get that pro-con thing of a more powerful cartridge. Of course, in reality, that 7.62 AK cartridge has more recoil energy than 5.56. It's not in any way super powerful by comparison to 5.56. They're pretty comparable. I know some people will disagree, but we can't really have that in typical video games because we have to have differentiation. We have to have that pro-con, that trade-off. And so we see an exaggeration of how much recoil it has, how much damage it does. And in the context of entertainment, it makes perfect sense to fully embrace that stereotype of the AK as rough, ready, but reliable and powerful, and especially if you're setting that against something like an M16 to contrast it.
As games have developed, the virtual weaponry that we play with keeps getting more and more detailed. I love that there are games like Arma 3 or Escape from Tarkov that go the extra mile and ensure every element of this iconic firearm is modelled and showcased with as much detail or authenticity as possible. Whereas other titles like Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, GTA 5 or Ghost Recon Breakpoint hybridize or simplify much of the weapon, instead letting it connect with the players through recognisable aesthetics and gameplay.
I'm out of ammo!
And with it being a weapon so firmly cemented in the minds of so many people, it may be unthinkable to have a modern video game shooter without some form of the AK present on the weapon list. The legacy that surrounds the real thing can be used to sow story elements and build on the narrative of the world, while the tropes that surround the virtual version can add much needed diversity to the guns at the player's disposal.
True to its famed resilience and robustness, whether in the real world, our movies, or even our video games, the Avtomat Kalashnikova is here to stay. Thank you so much for watching this week's episode of Loadout. If you enjoyed, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe for more like this, and let me know in the comments section what you'd like to see future episodes on. Or of course, you can reach out to me directly on Twitter @RegularDave.
If you want more video game weaponry content, you can watch the previous series of this show or check out our weekly series of Firearms Expert Reacts, where I show our friends at the Royal Armouries a selection of video game arms to break down. And make sure to subscribe, as we'll have a bonus video where Jonathan breaks down the different variants of the AK on the channel in the next couple of days.
Until next time, I've been your host, Dave Jewitt. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.